Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for this latest instalment in our Explorer Series live discussion. My name's John Barclay and today I'm joined with our Director of Consulting, Tony.
Hi everyone.
Today we'll be discussing and explaining the integral model. So getting into it, integral theory comes from Ken Wilber, and while it's a really good model, like the old saying, all models are wrong, but some are really helpful. So this one's actually really helpful because it is trying to portray a theory of everything.
Yeah.
Right? So would you like to just talk us through the quadrants and how it all sort of fits together so everyone understands what the integral model is?
Yes, certainly, John. Wilber tried to sort of, using a combination of looking at different management and leadership theories and psychology and philosophy and spirituality, he came up with this view of a theory of everything, where his intention was to try and provide a model where no matter what you were considering and what challenge you were focused with, it would all sit within one framework. And he separated it. He generated this sort of 2x2 matrix, which is often the way that some of these models work is, again, trying to keep it as simple as possible. And it's split up into 4 quadrants, and he was very sort of specific about what each quadrant contained, what was the purpose for the quadrant, and how the quadrant would operate. So you can see in the sort of graphic on the screen, there's a separation between a horizontal and a vertical. So from a vertical point of view, the sort of top boxes and the top 2 boxes and the bottom 2 boxes are separated into those things which are individual or relate to a person, and those things which relate to a team. So he's been able to separate it into those things that are collective or those things that are individual.
So the top part of the quadrant is all about the individual.
Yep.
And the bottom part of the quadrant is looking at the collective.
Yes.
And from an organisational point of view, we generally talk about that as organisational.
Yeah. So it's team or organisational and the individual, and everybody will have a different way of describing those. But fundamentally, that's the sort of what he was trying to get to.
And how has he separated, the left side of the quadrant versus the right-hand side of the quadrant?
So this is the sort of the bit of the model that many people struggle with a little bit more than individual and team. So the separation here is between those things which are, if you like, hidden and those things which are visible. So on the left-hand side are things which are internal. So his intention was to describe things which you couldn't see, but you knew exist.
Yeah.
So the obvious thing we use here is things like gravity. So people know that gravity exists, but they don't actually see gravity. They can't physically see it. What they see is a manifestation of gravity when something falls. And something is acting on the object that falls, and that thing that's acting on the object is gravity.
And if we think about that from a person point of view, that's what we're talking about in regards to those values.
Yes.
And beliefs and attitude and mindset.
Yep.
Is all that internal stuff that we know exists. We know those things are there. People have values, people have beliefs, they have their thoughts and intentions versus what that manifests into in regards to behaviours, which is more visible.
Which is more visible, and that's on the right-hand side of the quadrant from a sort of a left-hand, right-hand side. So these things are visible, and generally they are measurable, so people can physically measure them. So if we follow the sort of thoughts process, and it's a simple sort of analogy there, is that we know that we can actually measure brain waves. So people can see the brain in operation, so that's the physicality of the brain.
Yep.
But what people can't see is what is the brain thinking about. That's the left-hand side of the quadrant. So again, and there are plenty of relationships that act in that way. As a way of describing the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the model.
And how does that translate then, the left and right, when it comes to the collective, the organisational or the group?
So the left-hand side is sort of, from an organisational point of view, it's the collective thoughts of a group or a team or a part of an organisation, and often, how do we represent that? It's culture. That's what culture is about. It's a collective view or a collective collection of thoughts about how people operate.
And people sometimes describe that as shared beliefs, isn't it?
Yes.
So individually it's my beliefs,
collectively
it's shared beliefs.
Organisationally, rather than sort of measuring something in a singular sense, we're measuring something in a system sense. So organisations are a collection of systems which are intended to work together, and you can physically see those systems, and obviously you can physically measure those systems in terms of how effectively they're operating.
And that's where we talk about structure, roles, processes, procedures, those sorts of things that have physical things we create to create structure. Yeah.
The sort of, in essence, part of the organisational framework.
And the reason why this is, like I say, all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And this one, the reason why we use this one's so useful is because it helps join and connect the individual to the collective. It helps understand the internal aspects of what's happening with people, but also the visible aspects that we see.
Yep.
And it helps bring all that together. Hence why, Ken Wilber described it as the theory of everything.
His sort of view was that whether, irrespective of the challenge or the issue or the problem or the sort of improvement that you're trying to focus on, in very, very many instances, simply by focusing on one of the quadrant only will not give you the solution or the answer or the sort of change that you want to make.
Yeah.
Because generally the sort of the problem or the solution is usually got a focus or an element in more than one quadrant. It may not necessarily be in all quadrants, but it's certainly more than one quadrant.
Yeah.
But what we often find is people focus and fixate just on one quadrant, and then they define their issue and they define their solutions by focusing just on that single quadrant.
And probably the most common part to focus on is the visible, the system and behaviour.
We gravitate to those things which we can see.
Because I can see them, I can measure whether it's changed or not. And that's why some organisations may struggle with a change because they've only focused on two parts of the quadrant and actually haven't changed some beliefs and some shared beliefs.
The fact that they haven't recognised that it sits in other quadrants means that they haven't fully understood some of the influences or impacts that the change or the improvement or the process or whatever it is they're trying to put in place will have. So therefore they've only got half of or part of the problem, or they've only got part of the solution. And then therefore it doesn't work as effectively, or it may not work at all.
So integral means everything,
Yes.
and that's what the model's all about, trying to bring everything together. So how does this work then in connection with what we call maturity stages or cultural maturity stages? There's different models again.
Yes.
Lots of different models around cultural maturity and the maturity of collective groups and processes. We use one that comes from the integral theory as well. It comes a bit from that process background. So talk us through the 4 stages of maturity here.
So one of the ways of thinking about this is if you lay Wilber's model flat on the table and then put levels or layers above that, you get that the higher the levels go, the more mature the stages are in the cultural model. And this is a way of reflecting that just in a slightly different way. At the bottom end of the sort of maturity stages is the reacting culture, and this is probably the culture that lots of people will recognise because lots of organisations spend some of their time in this sort of cultural level. And it's the sort of firefighting, the reactive, not by its very nature reactive, that there is a tendency to wait for things to happen and then try and address or tackle the issue after it's happened. So there's not very much proactivity, there's very little foresight. It's really a sitting around and waiting for things to occur type.
And the more reactive, mature organisation spends a lot of time reacting.
Yes.
I think every organisation has an element of having to react to something, but those more mature, further up the scale, do less of that.
You will probably find that organisations which are very strongly wedded or very strongly fixed to this actually probably enjoy that sort of crisis phase that they seem to spend most of their organisational life in. And there's certainly there are times when crises will happen, irrespective of what level of cultural maturity you sit in. But being in a permanent place and permanently is not good.
No. So the next level is conforming culture. So what's changing in that space?
So people are moving away from being purely reactive to trying to begin to bring some level of organisation and control into their organisational culture. And there's a greater movement towards recognition of the value of rules and standards and procedural control, and having some structure and control to what the organisation, the individuals in the organisation do. And alongside that, they therefore spend obviously a large proportion of their time making sure that people comply with those rules and they understand those rules, and that if they don't comply with those rules, there's some consequence.
Yeah. And that's, when you think about, like you said, the 3D model of the integral model, the reactive culture is probably not paying too much attention to all 4 quadrants. conforming is now starting to inflate the systems bit.
Yes. So there's the beginning of a growing peak, and obviously that increasing peak will have an impact on the other four quadrants, as you would expect, because they are all connected together.
But probably predominantly with behaviour, because
Yes.
they're directly trying to do the same thing, deal with the visible things.
Yeah. So it's having, again, it's all left-hand side, it's all right-hand side of the integral model where the impact is having, because again, the focus here, certainly in the bottom two levels of the cultural maturity, is they're focusing on things that they can see and they can measure, because that's the easiest part of the model to have an impact on.
Yeah. And if we do that reasonably well, we might get some good shared beliefs around the rules and some individual beliefs, so you can still achieve a bit of that whole quadrant.
It has an impact on the other quadrants, because clearly as part of that, there's a certain way that leaders need to be leading. There's a certain level, a certain type of values that they would have and beliefs they would have to drive that cultural maturity. But in terms of the level of leadership, or the level of leadership maturity at that point is still relatively low, and so hence there's not quite so much of a level of development in the leadership area for a conforming culture.
Yeah. So if we're moving out of conforming, becoming more achieving, what's starting to change there?
So that this is then organisation beginning to drift into the left-hand side of the model, and there's more of an improvement focus. So people are beginning to recognise that the success is gained through people, and so therefore, how can we get the best value out of the people that we have in our organisation? How do we work out how to be better at doing things without necessarily focusing so much on the structural element of here's another document, here's another procedure, here's another process. Because as we know, organisations know at this level that there's more to getting a successful organisation than simply just complying to a set of rules.
And we can't, and they start to recognise we can't have a rule for everything, we can't have a procedure for everything. So we actually need to rely a lot on how people go about their performance.
Yeah, and because it's we're beginning to tap into people's inherent and individual capability, and so it's giving them the opportunity to start to think. And as you said, and again, that's moving us into the left-hand side of the model, where it's about things that we know happen but we can't see. People are starting to think and providing some structured those thoughts.
So what's shifting? So based on the fact now that achieving culture is really now embracing all four quadrants, what's significantly different from an achieving culture to an integral culture?
The integral culture is moves heavily towards the interconnectedness. So in a achieving culture, organisations begin to recognise the value of understanding problems in a more of a complex sense, but they're still very much insulated into their own operating areas. So they don't think about its interconnectedness to other parts of a business or other parts of the organisation. So they may well be moving forward in terms of making progress, but the level of progress they make is actually limited by the fact that they're not thinking outside of the box. In the integral culture, it's all about systems and systems thinking, and recognising that changing one thing here or trying to change one thing here will have an impact in a number of different areas. And how do we work out what that impact is before we make the change? And can we consider whether with that extra piece of knowledge and understanding, we end up with a better solution to start with? That's where integral culture gets organisations to.
So achieving culture is embracing all four quadrants, but probably in a singular place. Transforming into an integral culture is now still embracing all four quadrants in the whole collective of the organisation.
Yep.
So what feeds into us and who we impact.
Yeah, and this is in essence where Wilber's sort of integral model was leading towards, recognising that the better organisational cultures are those things which encompass everything rather than just encompass small or selected parts.
Yeah. Right. So when we look at that's what we really wanted to discover today and really get some clarity on, is the integral model is around a theory of everything, and to consider both the things we can see and can't see, thinking about the individual and the collective, while overlaying that with a level of maturity that comes with that, to really know where you're operating and where that function is at.
And it's very hard for organisations to stay at the high levels of maturity for long periods of time. And even those organisations which are operating at achieving or integral culture level will slide back towards a conforming or even a reacting culture at times, organisations which are operating the top end will recognise that slide is happening and begin to pull themselves back out again.
Yeah.
Whereas those organisations that sit at the bottom end of the cultural maturity will not recognise that. They'll be ignorant to the fact that they're sitting in a reacting or a conforming culture and will not know that there's anything different or any other way of operating.
And for those who have watched our previous episodes, especially if you look at white space, this is what we've been really trying to explore through this Explorer series, is each one of those changes, to get from any of those, there's some white space in between it, which is unknown. I'm not sure what it's going to take to now start getting into that systems piece. I'm not sure what it's going to take to now being into that beliefs and attitudes and mindset, that stuff I can't see. So there's always a level of uncomfortability to progress through the maturity.
Yeah, and as we said in the white space series, the white space is actually different between each level of maturity. So it's not as though you're going through the same set of challenges each time you transfer through the maturity levels. There are different type of challenges. There's a depth and breadth issue, but also there's a completely different set of issues that you need to face.
Yeah. So let's start looking at each of these in a little bit more detail with as Tony quite rightly said, it's about looking at that in a 3D sense. So when we talk about reactive culture and now putting the integral model together with that, just for everyone's context, reacting culture, depending on what model you're used to, you might have heard this as avoidant, you might have heard this as chaos, you might have heard this as emerging, pathological or basic.
Yeah, lots of different words.
There's lots of different examples of how to describe this stage of maturity, and basically they all mean the same thing.
Yep.
And when you look at this, you're able to look at all the individual characteristics of those quadrants. So what's some examples that we see from an individual point of view in a reactive culture? What sort of stands out to us there?
There's a very little sort of foresight or forward thinking, so that people tend to wait for others to tell them what to do. So they're faced with a problem, or they're faced with an issue, or they're faced with a concern. Because they're not used to thinking for themselves, they'll sit and wait for the leader to come and tell them this is what to do next. So you find lots of people standing around not doing very much.
Yeah.
It's a very, very sort of peaks and troughs in terms of activity. So lots and lots of activity because it's crisis related.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of activity. The crisis is over, and then everybody sits down and waits for the next one.
Yeah.
So from an efficiency, from a performance, it's generally very, very, very difficult to get a consistent level of good performance. It's very easy to have an inconsistent level of good performance.
And when we think about that in a leadership context, the perception is that leaders or people in position of authority are there to police things.
They're very directive. So they're giving very, very clear but very directive instructions. They're not allowing their teams to think about how to help that process. So they're only getting like a small value from having a team of people working for them.
Yeah. And then we start to see that. I mean, we think about for that from a safety context. Safety is really not a high priority, is it? It probably really rarely gets even spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, this is where you would see the strong sort of production versus safety bias being very strongly in the production sense, or the achievement sense in terms of achieving an outcome or a goal, irrespective of the other impacts that could be in place that actually have an impact on that successful achievement.
Yeah. And that whole collective group, then basically people just keep running to failure. Like we just keep going. If there's nothing wrong, don't do anything. Just keep going until something fails.
You're right, John. And then when things fail, there's often a very, very strong knee-jerk reaction to the failure. So, simple examples. There's a rash of hand injuries in an organisation. So what happens is, rather than trying to understand what's the cause of the hand injury, there's an instant directive: everybody needs to wear gloves.
Yeah.
But nobody really is giving any thought to what type of gloves, what's the type of injury that the individuals are being impacted by. So therefore, what type of gloves do we need to apply? And having a blanket requirement on gloves for everything means that you've got people of an organisation now that are wearing gloves that don't need to wear gloves.
Yeah.
But also you've got the situation where the gloves actually might now become more of a hazard because you've got rotational and entanglement risks, and people get a false sense of security that they're actually better protected now than they were before. all from a knee-jerk reaction to something where people are reacting to an event that's happened in the workplace.
And generally at this stage too, there may be systems or processes or rules, but they're generally not looked after. They're generally sitting on a shelf collecting dust.
It's that people will be aware that they are there, but they're very rarely looked at.
Yeah.
They're very rarely used, and they're adding very little value. And people have the view that they're actually not valuable at all.
Yeah.
So they actively work away from actually following or looking at the rules or the procedures because they don't value them at all.
And they're not generally sufficient. So what we mean by that is more often than not they're copy and paste from something else.
Yep.
I found a good one online and it ticks the box that we've got something around that. So reacting cultures, you can see, it evolves out both for the individual and the collective. You can really start to see some of these attributes in some organisations and some individuals, but hopefully those who are maturing see less of these attributes over time.
Yes. From a sort of organisational point of view, particularly not cultural, is that there's in these sort of reacting cultures, there's a lot of tribalism, a lot of protectionism. There's lots of separation between individual organisational units, even within the same organisational areas, or in operations, or sales, or a finance department. There'll be you'll get the cliques formed where little groups stick together and don't feel as though and don't operate as though they're part of a bigger team. Because that's the cultural sort of the way that the culture is developed, because they're very much looking after themselves and not thinking about anything else other than just themselves.
Yeah. All right, so let's have a look at the conforming culture. And you may have heard language around this level of maturity around either conforming, compliant, systematic, managing, calculative, or dependent. Right? So this is where we're actually dependent on others, or we've just got compliant orientation to process and instruction.
Yep.
First thing I want to start with, most people when you first say we just want people to comply, we just want people to do what we want them to do, and wish people would just follow the procedure.
Yes.
We hear those things all the time. When you look at this in a little bit more depth, like actually when you dig a bit deeper on that, what are some of the things we see that does to the individual?
It stops people from thinking. So it's a fallacy to expect organisations to be able to describe everything that could happen in the workplace in a procedure or a document.
And it's probably unrealistic to think someone can remember everything that's in thousands of pages of procedures.
Because you can imagine, it would be this thick to be able to describe and define everything. So with that in mind, the individuals then that go out into the workplace, there's sort of two or three different things working at the same time. So there's a bit of fear associated with this in terms of, will I actually remember everything that I need to remember? Because I know I've got 1,000 pages to remember, and will I remember everything?
And what happens when I get it wrong?
And what happens when I get it wrong? Because I probably know that I'm not going to remember everything. And so there's the first element of, there's an apprehension, fear, maybe not necessarily that level. The level of confidence the individuals have about what they know, what they should know is generally pretty low.
Yeah.
The second element is, so if something happens that's not covered by the procedure, which inevitably will be the case because the procedure can't cover everything, what do I do? How do I work out what the right course of action is? Now, in a situation where that is not significantly impacting, the individual may be able to manage that and not have an impact on him or herself or others. But if it's something that's got a high potential or high risk associated with it, that hesitancy or that uncertainty about what to do can have a major impact on that individual or the individuals that work around them.
Yeah.
So that there's usually two or three things working in these sort of conforming cultures that actually aren't great from an individual or organisational point of view.
While it's probably creating some greater definition of how we imagine work done, it probably starts to get a little bit of that happening, which is good for an intent point of view.
Yep.
But again, it can become overwhelming and create a bit of fear, a bit of confusion, a bit of hesitancy. People then don't, as you say, people stop thinking and don't necessarily feel like they've got an opportunity to grow. But on the other side of that, leaders start to behave a bit differently here too now, don't they?
Yes. So that sort of overt focus on compliance means that their behaviours are very much around people doing what the procedure says they should do and showing that they've done that. Yeah. So we're getting into a little bit of measurement, but the measurement is about the activity, not the reason for the activity.
Yeah.
So people begin to tick boxes. So as examples, there's a take 5 process, there's a pre-start process. So at an individual point of view, what's happening is that the individual, because of the leader's behaviour associated with have you done it, have you done it, have you done it, we need to have 10 done today, will just tick the boxes to get them done as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
We've all heard the stories of those being done in the crib room or the office or the riding to work, and I've got my 10 sheets already in my pocket ready for the next 10 days. So the value of the system is completely ignored.
Yeah.
It's just the compliance to the system which is the focus, and that's often driven by the leader saying we have to have 10 done this week or 12 done this week.
I need 2 hazard reports every day.
That's right. Whether the leader's actually looking at what the sheet is telling them and working out that's actually something that I should be concerned about, that's not part of this, typically it's not part of this conforming culture. It's simply, part of it is the numbers game, is making sure that they are achieving their targets.
Yeah.
KPIs in place, but the KPI is driving a different type of behaviour. It's driving a compliant behaviour around making sure that you hit the numbers, rather than focusing on why are we doing the work in the first place.
And this is, it becomes a little bit of a false sense of security in compliance cultures, isn't it? In that we focus so much on what we're doing from a paper sense that it gives us a false sense that things are actually going the way we think they should be going, because the forms are filled out, the reports are coming in, the inspections are getting done, but are they actually giving the impact the way that they're supposed to get? And the other thing I notice here in this stage too is we still get a sense of shifting responsibility start to occur now. What I notice in conforming cultures, especially, is just when you talk to a team about safety, they want the safety team to come over and do that.
Yeah.
They start to externalise these things to other teams rather than actually still keeping it to themselves.
Yep. And we know that can drive lots of different types of behaviour, the overly reliant on compliance and conformance. So they're externalising the issue and the solution to other parties, but there is also an external, from a solution point of view, the heavy reliance or heavy focus on conformance means that their solutions are often conformant related too. So the 1,000 pages gets to 1,500 and 2,000 pages because their solution focuses as much about we need to change the procedure or the document because it didn't cover that, so we add that into the procedure. And that just repeats itself constantly, and all that happens is more and more paper to be able to focus on.
And I guess that's the last point in here too, because of that overwhelming reliance on rules, procedures and policies and process, it just becomes overwhelming. It becomes high volume, it becomes highly complex, and it's actually reinforcing a lot of the issue that comes from compliance anyway, which is fear, confusion, and it just keeps growing because we add more to it.
That's right. And you often find in these heavily conforming cultures that the system itself is conflicting because it's so voluminous and so large and so complex that you end up with disconnects or lack of alignment between them, because people can't keep a good overview of what the system is intended to deliver in its entirety. There's too much of it to provide to keep that. So, and there's also too much of it to be able to align, this change with this change with this change with that change. So it builds confusion and it builds fear about, and then I've got 2 conflicting processes. Which one do I follow?
Yeah, because this one was written a while ago, this one's just been updated, but
they don't align.
It just creates confusion.
Yep.
So there's a good progression from obviously being in a reactive culture to conforming that's a little bit more about structure and trying to define the way we want to do our work. The challenge that comes with conforming culture is that reliance just on system. The system just keeps inflating, and it probably does a bit with behaviour and maybe a little bit with the individual's belief and the collective beliefs, but the left-hand side of that quadrant starts to get left behind.
Yes, very much so.
All right. So let's start looking at the achieving culture. So again, depending on what you're used to and what you've seen in the past, you might know this as proactive, independent, involving, or adoptive. So again, some other common language that sits around these stages of maturity. So what's starting to shift for the individuals here, from an individual belief point of view and behaviours, what's starting to happen here compared to where we were with conforming?
So we're getting more of a people focus now. So people begin to feel more valued from an organisational point of view. They're not, they're not just a number. They're actually people. That leaders are beginning to value their contribution, and so you're getting a greater togetherness. You're getting a greater performance. There's a greater focus on improvement. So it's not just about compliance. It's not just about following the rules. It's working out what didn't work and why didn't it work, and how can we change what we do or what we have been doing to ensure that we don't fall back into that same process again.
Because there's still rules and processes here, but the difference here is rather than just complying for the sake of it, there's actually commitment to that process, not just I've got to fill out that paperwork or I've just got to make sure that's completed before I go. So there's greater, the individual's becoming more and more committed to doing the work safely and doing the work in a way that's intended, but is prepared to put their input in to make it closer to the way it's actually done. What do we actually know? They're
getting a much greater sense of value as to why it's important for some level of control to be applied in situations of work. So by valuing the reason why the control is in place, and equally therefore recognising the issues when the procedure doesn't give, or the process doesn't give the intended outcome, that value of making sure that doesn't happen again is more intense in these sort of cultural maturity levels.
And what's happening here from a leadership point of view is a more balanced approach here. They're looking at the individual but the collective and the system. They're starting to actually look at how everything's influencing each other.
So we're beginning to get a stronger sense of using the larger sort of team that they've got available to them, and trying to bring in the expertise, the knowledge, the capability of the bigger team, rather than just being the leader who's got all the answers. One of the challenges with achieving culture is that it's still very much, the danger is that they still think about it just in a isolated sense. So as examples of that, an organisation chooses to bring in a new permit to work system. So one part of the business decides that the permit to work system is not working, and therefore they need to change it. So they put in an immense amount of work, and they use their whole team to give them what they believe is a really good quality solution, and then they roll it out. What they don't recognise is that there are other users of the permit system who are impacted by and use whatever comes out of that process, and their lack of involvement in that activity means that they are getting something given to them that have had no involvement in. And it may not necessarily work for their situations or their processes.
Or depending on how that's done, it could just drive conform. Just conform to it, but don't actually use it the way it's intended.
Sure. And equally, in a different environment, so a sales team decides that the sale order processing process isn't working, and it's not efficient, it's not effective. So again, they go away, and they may do this in an internal sense, so they might get finance involved and procurement involved, and any other people that need to be involved in that process to generate this fantastic new sales order processing, and they roll it out. But they've forgotten that the customer is actually one of the key elements, one of the key stakeholders in that process. And they haven't gone out and checked with the customer or had the customer be involved in that process to work out whether that solution works. So they're progressive in terms of the improvement sense, but they're not progressive, or they're not got to the level where they recognise the entirety, back to the 4 quadrants and using the 4 quadrants in its entirety. They're not quite at the level where they're tapping into those 4 quadrants in as much of a sense as they could do.
Yeah. And the collective group here that we're talking about is that actual stakeholder engagement that may be missing, but internally it's working really well. So in our internal team about sharing ideas is working really well, but maybe not so much with the other stakeholders outside of the team.
Yeah, it's recognising the sort of the complete stakeholder package rather than just the obvious stakeholders. Lower down the maturity framework, there's a lack of a recognition of the stakeholder at all. When we get to achieving, people have suddenly realised that my team, my role impacts on others, but they're not necessarily recognising how wide that impact can be.
Yeah. And from a systems point of view, I mean, obviously, as it shows on there, there's very active processes in there to review, update, improve it. There's constantly review, because the system is so important in that quadrant process that it's just not left behind. We don't just make all these changes, we actually do actively improve the system. Versus a conforming culture where the systems can become a little bit set and just force it onto people rather than actually adapt it and adjust it.
And from a system point of view, along that similar line, the measurement processes that are in place in the sort of lower tiers around, as we said, activity. At this level, we're beginning to use measurement to track behaviour and whether we're getting outcomes from what we expect the system to deliver. So the KPIs are becoming more mature, and they're actually being more valuable to the organisation in terms of showing the benefits and the outcomes of the system in a more of a proactive, positive sense, rather than, and therefore what's changing from a behavioural point of view, rather than just we've got 2, we've got 5, we've got 10.
And this is the thing I've started to notice with the organisations that move into this maturity is they do become a little bit more comfortable with the qualitative side of things, not always the quantitative side of things. So I say the number 5 of these, 10 of these, that's generally what conforming culture is like, because it's black and white. Once we start to get into achieving, and especially in integral, we're actually becoming quite comfortable with the qualitative side of things. Just the feedback around what's happening and how people are feeling and thinking and working towards that. It's not always about the number anymore, it's actually about how we're impacting the whole.
Yes.
Right. So looking at the integral culture, so again, depending on what model you've looked at in the past, you've probably heard about this as a values-based culture, interdependent culture, resilient, generative, exceptional, optimised. So there's lots of different languages around this stage of maturity, depending on what research paper you've looked at and what model you've gone back with. So we've talked a bit about this already, but what are some examples that start to happen in this space? What's it starting to look like from the individual point of view here compared to achieving?
I think what you begin to see here is that there is less of a visible view of silos within the organisation. So most organisations are set up so that they run vertically, sort of from top to bottom. In a truly integral culture, they're running horizontally. So they're process orientated, and so that they run from the start to the end of a process rather than from the start to the end of a function. Which means that in a team structure, teams are obviously multifunctional, but they're not necessarily quite so wedded to the hierarchy of who am I working for, from a direct leader and reporting structure. So it means that teams are much more flexible in terms of how they work, and therefore they're much more successful because they're actually using the right skill mix and the right involvement mix from right around the organisation. Leaders are more likely, and people are more comfortable with the leaders being the leader of a process rather than the leader of a function. So in these integral cultures, an individual may have 2 or 3 people that are actually in a leadership role that they interact with, but they may not necessarily be their direct line management leader. You see a lot of really high quality improvement activity taking place in integral culture organisations, where they're very good at identifying stakeholders and the stakeholder management and a full understanding of what the stakeholders want, need, and that drives a lot of what they do in terms of solution focus. You get much more robust and fully encompassing solutions because they start with the premise of let's make sure that we fully understand the problem. So rather than some of the issues of let's get through the problem identification stage as quickly as we can so we can get on to do something, in the integral cultures they actually flip that around and say let's just make sure that we spend enough time to really understand what it is we're trying to solve here. Do we actually really understand what the problem is? And using the 4 quadrants as a way of making sure that they tap into the invisible and the visible and the group or the organisation and the individual, and have they got a really good understanding about what the leadership or the behaviour or the cultural aspects are, as well as the systems. Once they've really understood that, they can mirror that in the solution phase to make sure that the solutions match up with what they found in the problem identification phase. So it's a much more rich experience for an individual, and it's much more rich experience for an organisation. The difficulty is there are not very many organisations that do this really well, and it actually is quite hard to get to that point and actually stay there.
I was about to say, that's been my experience as well. You see organisations operate for significant periods of time in an achieving culture, and I think to simplify that, the achieving culture, the most common thing you hear still is it's a bit siloed. That's probably the most common thing you hear in an achieving culture. We're still a little bit siloed. As soon as we break out of that and start to become interconnected and get that integral cultural maturity happening, you only need something to happen in your team again
and people slide back.
People slide quickly back to sort of fix that problem and work together with their team. So I agree. I think people have stepped into these spaces for periods of time, but have then found they've had to go back into a little bit more of a protection space within their own teams and their own silos.
Space. And I think a lot of that is, I guess, 2 points related to the culture that the organisation generates, because it is heavily dependent on people feeling safe in their culture and the culture of the organisation, because you begin to get to a point where you're taking direction, guidance from a wide range of different leaders. And you have to be comfortable to be able to work with a wide range of different leaders, knowing that he or she is not your direct leader. Now, one of the challenges that brings is from a performance point of view. If we're used to this sort of standard process of performance reviews being very much related to the individual's relationship with their direct manager.
Yeah,
the hierarchy. In an integral culture, there's an opportunity, and the better organisations have this process of collecting performance feedback from a wide range of different people in an organisation, because it recognises that me as an individual may work with 5 different leaders in a 6-month period, in different roles, of which none of them are actually my direct leader. How do I get the feedback from those 5 different leaders? That's an important element of being an integral culture, is having a mechanism and people being comfortable in that mechanism to give feedback on somebody that actually doesn't work for them directly, and people that are, if you like, receiving that, being actively wanting to gain that feedback from others so that they can actually contribute more towards the integral culture.
And that's, for me, I think that's one of the most distinctive things that starts to happen in this stage is, while that individual feedback with my leader may still be occurring, there's a whole heap of other feedback going on. I used to try and get people to understand in an organisation, really to get here, you've got to have a feedback-rich environment. It's literally got to be, everyone is giving feedback, whether you are in the same team or whether you're in the same department, it doesn't matter. We're just giving, everyone gets information and feedback from each other, because from an individual point of view at this stage, everybody feels like we need each other. Like we actually need to be successful together. Just because I'm successful in my patch, it doesn't make the organisation successful. I've got to do what I'm responsible for and accountable for, but there's a strong sense of I need everyone to be successful.
It's moved very strong from the I to the we. Where success is only gained by the collective. It's not gained by the individual being successful. So if I can show that I'm really successful, but everybody else has failed, that's not what you see in integral culture. No, everybody's success is measured by collectively how successful everybody is, and if somebody's falling behind in an integral culture, the team work to bring them back.
Point where they're all being successful again, rather than just saying, "Well, I'm all right, Jack."
And this is where there's a really strong sense of belonging and a really strong sense of care for each other. I mean, this is a very high care culture, and that's what comes in. And I guess from a systems point of view, as you said before, this is where systems theory comes in. It's not about more systems, more layers. It's systems theory. It's systems thinking around how all these 4 quadrants are a part of a system.
And in those sort of organisations which have been at integral culture and been at that level for quite a while, what you would begin to see is the systems actually become less dense. They become less cumbersome. There's less documentation because the systems, they're very succinct, and they're providing a framework or a principle. But the confidence the organisation has is that they can allow their organisational and the people in their organisation to complete the work in a way which is required, but without a lot of procedural guidance. And they're using the value and the contribution that they get from having people being able to think freely or more freely as a way of doing that.
So when we think about the integral model and culture maturity, and they have to be, for it to be done successfully, for organisations really to understand what's happening and be able to make change, you've got to be able to look at it in that 3D way. You've got to be able to look at the attributes, and every organisation would have elements of those attributes on all 4 levels of maturity in all 4 quadrants. What we're striving to do is to understand which bits are we trying to do less of, and which bits are we trying to do more of. And when organisations really get an understanding of the whole picture, both the invisible and visible, the individual and the collective, and then start to look at the different perspectives or different levels of maturity with that, that's when they start to truly push beyond what they ever thought was possible.
Yeah.
Because what I've always liked about when teams or even organisations start to get into that integral process, anything's possible. You start to see some really amazing aspirations to what's achievable.
Yeah. I think you're right, John. And that one of the beauties in those situations, as they build through the maturity levels, they actually get more capable and more conscious of recognising where they actually are. This sort of self-awareness process increases significantly, which means as they progress up through, we said earlier that people, that organisations can begin to fall backwards. The higher levels of maturity are more aware about the fact that they're actually moving in the wrong direction, and they can pick themselves up and turn themselves around again. Because, as we've said already, it's very, very difficult to stay at the same level of maturity constantly for long periods of time. There are things that are impacting the organisation constantly, and sometimes that has a detrimental effect in terms of the way the organisation reacts to it. The more self-aware that individuals in an organisation is, the greater they are at lifting themselves back up to a more effective maturity level.
So I hope everyone's found that conversation or that awareness of the integral model in the context of the culture maturity really helpful to understand. Look, this is complex. That's why it's not an easy thing for people to.
Right.
There's no silver bullet. There's no sort of magical wand that happens here. It's really being self-aware of the attributes that are occurring and put them in the context of the integral model. Where is that happening? Is that happening with the individual's internal beliefs, or is it a collective belief, or is it an individual's action, or is it a collective system or structure? And where's that happening on a maturity level? Is it happening in a reactive way? Are we really focusing on a conforming mindset, a conforming role? Are we really doing well at it and achieving really well, but we're doing it in isolation, like we're doing it in silo? Or have we really branched out and brought the whole business, the whole group, the whole organisation with us? Thank you for watching our Explorer series on the integral model. You can watch more episodes here, and you can follow us here.